Welcome to The Deep Dive, the show that takes history's most influential figures, radical ideas, and complex sources, and extracts the knowledge you need to be truly well-informed. Today, we are undertaking a monumental task. Decoding the life and foundational philosophy of Siddhartha Gautama, a person whose influence, spanning over 2.5 millennia, remains just about unmatched in ethical thought, the man who would become the Buddha.
And this deep dive feels essential because, the popular narratives often obscure just how revolutionary his teaching actually was. Our mission is clear. We are going to move past the image of the serene golden statue to explore the historical man, the radical structure of his core doctrine, the Four Noble Truths, and perhaps the most challenging philosophical concept he ever delivered, Anattasa, the doctrine of no self. We're drawing solely from the extensive sources provided to understand why this figure was so critical then and why his ideas remain so vital today.
And right out of the gate, the sources deliver what might be the biggest challenge to common belief systems about the Buddha. We really have to establish this fact immediately. He did not claim to be a god, a prophet, or, some kind of avatar. He offered no divine inspiration whatsoever.
That is the single most important framing device for this entire deep dive. If we forget everything else, remember this. He explicitly attributed all of his ultimate realizations, his attainments, and his achievements entirely to human endeavor and human intelligence. He placed the individual in the supreme position, stating that the path to awakening is purely a human possibility.
So it's a system built on self-reliance.
Exactly. Encapsulated in that profound statement, one is one's own refuge. Who else could be the refuge? This just transforms the entire framework from one based on faith and dogma into one based on personal responsibility and verifiable experience.
Okay, let's unpack the historical man. When we look at the timeline, we place him around the 6th or 5th century BCE, which was a truly fascinating period of intense philosophical searching in North India. This was the era of the Axial Age, when figures like Confucius and the Greek philosophers were redefining human existence.
Absolutely. The time frame is traditionally dated with some scholarly variation, placing his birth around 563 or maybe 480 BCE, and his death at the age of 80, around 483 or 400 BCE, in a place called Kushinagar. He was born as Siddhartha Gautama, or Siddhartha Gautama in Pali.
And his origins are important. He wasn't royalty in the way we might think of it today.
Right. He was born into the Shukya Republic, which was a relatively small, self-governing oligarchy or chieftainship in the Himalayan foothills, now near the border of Nepal and northern India.
And the meaning of his name, Siddhartha, is so beautifully fitting for what he eventually accomplished.
It translates roughly to he who achieves his goal. And that sense of destiny, or perhaps just rigorous self-determination, is reflected in his life's work. When he achieved that goal awakening, he earned the title Buddha, the Awakened One.
Another very common name you hear is Shakyamuni,
meaning the sage of the Shakyas, which honors his clan.
But the sources also confirm that the term he most frequently used when referring to himself wasn't Buddha or Shakyamuni, it was Tathagata. That name is so evocative, yet it feels intentionally elusive.
It is, and its elusiveness is philosophically vital. Tathagata is usually translated as one who is thus gone or one who has thus come.
So why the ambiguity?
Because it signifies a state of being that is beyond the dualities of language and, conceptualization. It reinforces his transcendence of ordinary categories. He is beyond all coming and going, beyond birth and death. It signifies someone who has accomplished the ultimate human goal and is no longer subject to the transitory phenomena that govern the rest of us.
So it's a descriptive title, not a reifying one. He's not a fixed thing. Let's talk about the biographical turning point, his youth of privilege, and the legendary moment of the Great Renunciation.
The sources paint a picture of an extraordinarily sheltered early life. He was married young, around age 16, to Yashohara, and they had a son, Rahula. He lived in the palace, shielded from all the harsh realities of life. The story goes that he saw the four sights: an old man, a sick man, a corpse, and finally a wandering ascetic.
These weren't just sad things he saw, they were profound existential shocks for him.
They were the realization of universal suffering, dukkha, which becomes the cornerstone of his later philosophy. The realization that aging, sickness, and death are just inescapable aspects of human existence. Even for him, even in his gilded cage, it propelled him into a crisis.
He realized that the luxurious life offered no permanent shelter from change.
And his response was radical. At age 29, he gave up everything.
This is the Great Renunciation.
He abandoned the palace, his family, his position, voluntarily becoming homeless. He shaved his hair and beard, put on a simple robe, and became a shamana.
And what exactly was a shamanan?
It was a philosophical class of wandering practitioners, ascetics who toiled and exerted themselves for religious and spiritual purposes. He was entering a highly competitive marketplace of ideas and rigorous self-discipline that already existed in ancient India, challenging the established Brahmanic dogma.
This wasn't just aimless wandering, though. He sought out the absolute top experts in spiritual technology.
He was methodical and, frankly, brilliant. His search led him to two very prominent Brahmanic meditation teachers. The first was Araka Kalama, under whom he mastered the attainment called the sphere of nothingness. This is a deep, profound, mystical trance. The second was Adraka Ramaputra, where he reached the even higher state of the sphere of neither perception nor non-perception.
These sound like ultimate mystical achievements. Why did he leave them? The sources imply he mastered them almost instantly.
Because they did not provide the ultimate solution. He found that even these states, as sublime and profoundly peaceful as they were still conditioned states.
They were impermanent.
Exactly. When the trance ended, the suffering would return. They did not lead to nibbana, to the true final liberation. His dissatisfaction drove him to a path of extreme, almost superhuman asceticism. Practices very similar to the Jains meditating without breath, consuming only the barest minimum of food, reaching near starvation.
The images we have of the emaciated Buddha really powerfully capture the intensity of that 6-year period.
Oh, absolutely. He was pushing the human body to its absolute limits. But he realized this, too, was a dead end. It was physically debilitating and spiritually unproductive. It prevented the clarity needed for deep insight. This led to his pivotal discovery, the revolutionary insight that defined his teaching, the middle way, or Majjhima Patipada.
A path that avoids both the self-indulgence he experienced in the palace and the self-mortification he experienced in the jungle. This moderation is what led to his awakening, or nirvana, under the Bodhi tree.
Yes. And when we talk about nirvana, we must strip away the common misconception that it is a heaven or, permanent residence with a god. It is far more clinical, almost like a diagnosis and a cure. Nirvana is liberation, vimutti, defined as the literal extinguishing of the fires of desire, raga, hatred, dosa, and ignorance, moha.
So those 3 factors are what fuel the cycle of suffering and rebirth, Sasa.
That's right. It's the ultimate freedom from conditioned existence.
And finally, the last chapter of his life, his parinirvana at age 80, the sources suggest he faced death with the same deliberate, methodical control he applied to his entire life.
The account, primarily in the Mahaparinmandita Sutta, showcases his absolute composure and compassion. He consumed his final meal, offered by the blacksmith Kunda, and subsequently fell violently ill. The crucial detail here is his insistence that his attendant, Ananda, reassure Kunda that the meal was a source of the greatest merit.
So he made sure that Kunda, who must have felt immense guilt, was relieved of that burden.
A final act of profound compassion, even while his body was failing.
And the final act of cessation itself wasn't a biological failure, but a conscious, masterful letting go.
It was a conscious withdrawal. He entered a complex, ordered sequence of high meditative states called dhyanas and immaterial attainments. To briefly contextualize, dhyanas are states of absorption achieved through deep concentration.
So he's moving through these states.
He moved through the 4 physical dhyanas, which are marked by progressively refined physical stillness and mental clarity, and then the 4 immaterial attainments, the highest non-material mystic states he'd learned from his old teachers.
And what was the significance of this sequence? Why do it that way?
By moving through these high states and then consciously returning to the 4th dhyana right at the moment of death, he demonstrated absolute masterful control over the cessation process. Dying in the 4th dhyana signifies that he was beyond the ability of any earthly condition, including disease, to disturb his mind. Parinirvana signifies the final cessation of the 5 aggregates that constituted his living body and mind, ending the possibility of rebirth in any form.
So the biography shows the sheer intensity of his search. What he discovered and then shared for the next 45 years is encapsulated in the 4 Noble Truths. This is the heart of the Dharma.
It is the core framework. And the central motivation behind his teaching was intensely practical. How do we navigate life with its inherent stress, uncertainty, and change, with peace, clarity, and compassion? The 4 Noble Truths are the answer, presented not as divine revelation, but as a scientific diagnosis.
And this is where we address that crucial conceptual shift. We are not treating them as static articles of faith or dogma.
No. We must view them as handlingsoppfordringen, calls to action, or tasks. The sources make it clear they are things you must do. They transform the teaching into an active toolkit for internal transformation, a practice framework, not a belief system.
So you think of the Buddha as a physician, a Bisaka.
Exactly. The truths define the disease, the cause, the prognosis, and the treatment.
Let's start with the diagnosis. The first noble truth, dukkha. We often translate this as simple suffering, but the philosophical weight is so much heavier.
If dukkha just meant pain, the teaching would be purely pessimistic. It is far more subtle. It certainly includes the obvious forms of suffering, birth, aging, sickness, death, sorrow, separation from loved ones, association with the unloved. But the Buddha, as a wise and scientific doctor, taught that pleasure, asada, must always be understood alongside its inherent danger or unsatisfactory nature, aldinava.
So why is even happiness considered unsatisfactory?
This is the critical philosophical insight. The suffering of conditioned states, samkara dukkha. The fundamental principle, quoted directly in the sources, is, whatever is impermanent is dukkha, yad anikam tam dukkham. Since all things in the phenomenal world, our bodies, our relationships, our greatest achievements, and even the highest spiritual states of trance are impermanent, they are ultimately unsatisfactory because they must change.
So the pain isn't the impermanence itself, but our inherent psychological resistance to that change. We want things to stay the same.
Exactly. The human mind seeks permanence and stability in a universe defined by flux. The realization that everything we cling to will inevitably pass is the source of deep, pervasive stress or dukkha. Therefore, the task for the first noble truth is that it should be fully understood. It demands a radical realism about the nature of existence.
This realization drives us to the second noble truth, samudaya, the origin of suffering. If flux is the nature of reality, what causes us to resist it?
The cause is identified as tancha, or craving, often translated as thirst. This is the impulsive, demanding reaction we have when we encounter either pleasure, where we crave more, or pain, where we crave its absence. This craving is rooted in the three fundamental defilements: greed, aversion, and ignorance, avijja.
And the deepest root of that craving.
It is the deep, fundamental attachment to the self-centered viewpoint. We crave, desire, and avert for the supposed benefit of this illusory permanent I. It is the constant effort to satisfy a non-existent, fixed entity that drives the entire cycle of reactive behavior.
So the task here is absolute.
It is. This craving must be discarded, eliminated, destroyed, and eradicated, pahataba. It is not a gentle process of modification. It is the annihilation of the root cause.
Which leads us to the positive objective. The third noble truth, nirodha, the cessation of suffering. This is the state of fully realized nirvana.
Right. Nirvana is defined by the three extinctions: the complete cessation of thirst, the extinction of desire, ragakayo, hatred, dosakayo, and illusion, mohike. Philosophically, it is the absolute, known as the asamkata, or the unconditioned.
Let's pause on that term, asamkata, because it's vital for understanding the difference between the conditioned world and the ultimate reality.
To call nirvana the unconditioned means that it is fundamentally distinct from everything in samsara, the cycle of conditioned existence. Everything conditioned samkata arises from causes, conditions, and aggregates, and therefore it is subject to change and decay. The asamkata is independent of all of those causes and is therefore permanent and unchanging.
So it's beyond the duality of relative terms like negative and positive.
It is simply the realization of truth, yathabhuto, or seeing things exactly as they are.
The sources also bring up a fascinating later philosophical extension of this truth, particularly in Mahayana schools, that seems to dissolve the distinction between the conditioned world and nirvana.
This is where thinkers like Nagarjuna enter the picture. He asserted that samsara, the cycle of birth and death, the conditioned world, is ultimately not different from nirvana. This perspective suggests that the distinction is purely subjective.
A change in viewpoint, not location.
Exactly. If you view reality through the lens of craving, ignorance, and attachment to self, you experience samsara. If you view the exact same reality objectively, seeing its impermanence and lack of self-nature, you realize nirvana.
The task for the third noble truth remains clear, though, regardless of the philosophical school, to realize it, to make it concrete, Satchigatapa.
Absolutely. The final piece of the diagnosis is the prescription. The fourth noble truth, magga, the path.
This is the implementation phase, the practical blueprint for transformation.
The fourth truth is simply the Noble Eightfold Path. If we accept the diagnosis, dukkha, the cause, craving, and the prognosis, nirvana, the path is the mechanism to achieve the cure. The final task here is practical and enduring, to follow it and keep to it, bhavataba.
So the foundation of all that diagnosis, the reason we suffer through craving, is this fundamental error of believing in a permanent self. This brings us to the really radical core of Buddhism, anatta, or no self.
Anatta is the definitive philosophical knife that separates Buddhism from nearly every other major spiritual tradition of the time, especially the Brahmanic schools like Advaita Vedanta, which sought to realize the ultimate, singular self, the Atman. The Buddha flatly rejected the idea of an abiding, immortal substance, a soul, calling it simply a false belief.
So if there is no permanent I, what are we? If you look under the hood of what we call a person, what do the sources say we are made of?
We are a constantly changing flux of physical and mental energy, a collection known as the five aggregates, Panyakanda. The important thing is that these groups are in continuous, momentary dissolution and reformation. They do not remain the same for 2 consecutive moments. The sources literally state, A is not equal to A.
Let's define these components one by one because they are the entirety of our perceived existence.
Okay, first you have matter. Rupa, this is the physical body, the material form. It's constantly changing, decaying, and dependent on food and environment.
Simple enough. What's second?
Sensations, Vedana. This includes all feelings, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, that arise from contact between a sense organ and an object. They are fleeting, they arise and pass instantly.
Third is perceptions.
Danshina.
Right, this is the faculty of recognition. It labels, identifies, and registers objects, whether physical, like seeing a tree, or mental, like identifying a thought. Like sensations, perceptions are momentary.
Number 4 is mental formations. Sahara. This one sounds complex. It is a massive and crucial category. It encompasses all volitional activities, the mental forces that condition our future state. This includes intentions, attitudes, determinations, and most importantly, karma.
And finally, consciousness, Inyenya. Many people mistake this last one for the eternal soul.
That is the common error, particularly when people import Western theological assumptions into the study of Buddhism. The Buddha dismantled this idea, demonstrating that consciousness is dependently originated. It is simply the reaction or response that arises when a sense base, like the eye, contacts an object, like a visible form.
So visual consciousness depends on the eye and the form. Without them, it just doesn't exist.
Exactly. It is conditioned, and therefore it is impermanent. Since all 5 aggregates are impermanent, no single element can be considered an unchanging, abiding self.
And the denial of the self is stated in the broadest possible terms in the texts.
The statement is definitive. All dhammas are without self, savetya anatta. The term dhamma here is key. It is the widest concept in the philosophy, encompassing everything, both conditioned things, samkara, and the unconditioned, nirvana. By stating that all things, even the state of ultimate liberation, are without self, he demolishes the possibility of finding an enduring, fixed essence anywhere, even outside of phenomenal existence.
So the quest to find one's true self or ultimate divine identity is, within this framework, considered a fundamental delusion.
Precisely. To believe that the universe is the Atman, or that one will exist as an everlasting, unchanging identity after death, is called wholly and completely foolish. This framework requires us to operate entirely outside the theological assumptions most Western students of religion bring to the table.
This inherent complexity leads directly to the persistent misinterpretations, like that famous quote, "Atte hi atanonato."
This is a perfect example of importing a foreign concept. People who are determined to find an eternal self often translate atahi atanonatho as self is the Lord of self. But this ignores the linguistic context. In this phrase, atta is used as a reflexive or indefinite pronoun meaning one or oneself, and natho means refuge, health, or support.
So the true meaning is an exhortation for self-reliance.
Yes, one is one's own refuge, help, support. It is an ethical and psychological statement about personal effort and responsibility, having nothing to do with metaphysics or the nature of the soul.
This brings us to the famous instance of the Buddha's silence. When the wanderer Vajragota asked him directly whether the Atman existed, the Buddha said nothing. Why the silence?
The Buddha had 4 methodical ways of dealing with questions. He could not say, there is self, because that would be a lie and contradict his entire life's work. But he also recognized that not all truth is helpful at all times. Vajragota was philosophically unprepared to absorb the idea of no self.
So if the Buddha had simply said, there is no self,
Vajragota would have been confused and disturbed, thinking, wait, then who is acting? Who is reaping the results of action?
So the silence was a compassionate, pragmatic maneuver to avoid setting back Vacchagotta's spiritual journey.
Exactly. It was a demonstration that the question of eternal selfhood does not lead to liberation and should be set aside until the path itself yields the realization of anatta naturally.
Now, for the biggest paradox that Anatta presents to the average listener, if there's no permanent abiding soul, how do karma and rebirth work? If nothing permanent is transferred, what connects one life to the next?
This requires a shift from thinking in terms of substance to thinking in terms of process. First, let's redefine karma. It is not divine justice. It is defined simply as volition, satana. Having willed, one acts through body, speech, and mind. It's a natural, impersonal law of cause and effect, where volitional actions create energies and tendencies.
So how does that energy continue when the body dies? If the aggregates cease, what continues the process?
Think of it through analogy, which the sources sometimes employ. Imagine a lit candle from life. A lighting another candle, which is life B. Did the first flame transfer its substance?
No!
No. The first flame ceased, but the energy, the heat, and the action allowed the continuum to manifest in the next moment, life B.
Another analogy is a river.
Yes, you might call it the Ganges River, from source to sea, but no two drops of water are the same at any two moments. It is a continuous process of flowing energy, not a fixed substance.
So at the moment of death, the physical and mental aggregates of life, A, cease, but the accumulated karmic volitions, the energy of attachment and action condition, the arising of a new set of aggregates, life B.
Precisely. The karmic effects continue to manifest in the continuum. The 5 aggregates of the dead person cease, but the process itself, bearing the karma, does not cease until nirvana is achieved. There's no entity that moves from one body to the next, only a causal connection between the volitional energy of the past moment and the arising of the new moment.
So we have the diagnosis, dukkha, the cause, craving rooted in self-clinging, and the goal, nirvana. The practical training, the manual for daily life, is the Noble Eightfold Path, the living blueprint of the middle way.
This is the practical implementation of the Four Noble Truths. It is organized into a gradual, cumulative, and intensely methodical process, summarized into the threefold training, showing that the path is holistic, developing the moral, mental, and intellectual dimensions simultaneously.
Let's lay out that structure again, because it's the framework for everything that follows.
1. Wisdom, panya, which is right view and right intention. This sets the cognitive direction. 2. Moral discipline, sila, which is right speech, right action, and right livelihood. This governs external conduct. And 3. Concentration, samadhi, which is right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. This cultivates the mind.
Wisdom panya is the indispensable starting point. Right view dictates everything.
Right view is the necessary perspective. The source is divided into 2 crucial levels. First, mundane right view is the understanding of the law of karma, the recognition that actions are not arbitrary, but intrinsically wholesome or unwholesome based on their roots, greed, aversion, delusion, and their opposites. This provides the ethical foundation for daily life.
So it's about recognizing moral accountability without requiring a divine judge. What is the second level?
The superior right view is the direct, intuitive comprehension of the Four Noble Truths themselves. This is the ultimate intellectual breakthrough that recognizes the inherent defectiveness and impermanence of all conditioned existence, driving the practitioner toward liberation.
The mundane supports the superior.
And the second component of wisdom is right intention.
Right. Intention provides the mental counterforce to craving and ill will. It demands intentions governed by selfless renunciation or detachment from desire, goodwill, metta, and harmlessness, nonviolence. This shows that true intellectual wisdom must always be accompanied by noble ethical qualities.
And the practical methodology for cultivating goodwill is key here, the systematic practice of metta and karuna.
Metta, loving kindness, is the direct remedy for ill will.
Yes, characterized by an intense, selfless love. It is not a sentimental emotion, but a profound, cultivated state. The technique of metta bhavana is meticulous. The practitioner begins by radiating metta towards themselves, objectively, not selfishly, and then sequentially radiates that feeling outward to a dear person, a neutral person, and critically, a hostile person.
The aim is to shatter the psychological boundaries that divide us from them.
Exactly. Similarly, compassion, karuna, is cultivated by contemplating the suffering of an individual and extending the fervent wish for that suffering to cease. You're applying the radical realism of the first noble truth to others. The development of both panya, wisdom, and karuna, compassion, equally is essential for perfection.
Moving to the second training, sila, moral discipline. These are the ethical guardrails governed by the perspective gained from right view.
They are the foundation of wholesome social and personal conduct, essential aids for mental purification. Sila involves both avoidance, varita, of the unwholesome and active performance, karita, of the wholesome.
Let's break down the three components of moral conduct, starting with right speech.
Right speech demands abstinence from four specific harms: lying, slander, harsh speech, and idle chatter. You're trying to speak only what is useful, timely, and truthful. It actively promotes harmony and friendship.
Next, right action.
Right action involves three abstentions: from destroying life, from stealing, and from sexual misconduct. For lay followers, sexual misconduct is defined specifically to protect existing relationships and curb desire by forbidding relations with illicit partners.
And for monastic practitioners, this becomes complete celibacy.
Correct.
And right livelihood is where the ethical framework directly intersects with economics and commerce. This is a very clear social mandate.
It is a critical instruction. One must earn a living legally, peacefully, and honestly. The Buddha specifically identified 5 trades that must be avoided because they directly contribute to the suffering of others: dealing in weapons, dealing in living beings, so raising animals for slaughter or trafficking humans, meat production, poisons, and intoxicants.
This demonstrates Buddhism's fundamental systemic opposition to violence and harm.
The sources also detail how the Buddha expanded his ethical framework to integrate with the social structure of his time, moving beyond personal salvation.
Yes, in the Sigalovada Sutta, he reinterpreted the ancient ritual of worshipping the 6 directions into 6 sets of social duties.
Instead of merely facing east, you turn to your parents. Instead of south, to your teachers. West, to your wife and children. North, to your friends. Nadir, down to your servants and employees. And zenith, up to recluses and Brahmins.
This provides a blueprint for an entire interconnected social network built on mutual responsibility and respect, ensuring the stability and well-being of the social fabric.
Finally, we arrive at the third training: samadhi, concentration, or mental culture, bhavana. This is the intensive work of purifying the mind,
Bhavana means mental development.
aimed at cleansing the mind of defilements, specifically the 5 hindrances: sensual lust, ill will, sloth and torpor, restlessness and worry, and skeptical doubt. The path uses 2 forms of concentration: samatha, or serenity, which leads to deep trance states, useful but not essential for liberation, and vipassana, or insight.
And vipassana is the distinctively Buddhist analytical approach.
Correct. Vipassana relies on sustained, momentary concentration, a continuous awareness of changing phenomena to observe the true nature of reality. This is achieved primarily through right mindfulness, satipatthana.
The Satipatthana Sutta is considered the most important text for mental development. What does it instruct us to observe?
It instructs us to maintain focused awareness on 4 foundations. 1, the body, seeing it as impure, subject to decay, not an object of attachment. 2, feelings, observing feelings as they arise and pass, recognizing their suffering nature. 3, the mind, observing the momentary changing contents of the mind as impermanent. And 4, mental objects, observing all phenomena and concepts as they arise, recognizing the ultimate truth that they are all without self, anatta.
This sounds exhausting, constant attention to the present moment.
It is demanding, but the core principle of mental culture is living entirely in the present moment, because the past is gone and the future is not yet born. This continuous awareness leads to insight, vipassana, into the 3 characteristics: permanence, suffering, and no self.
And the mental energy to sustain this constant awareness is managed by right effort.
Right effort defines the internal struggle against the defilements. It consists of 4 great endeavors: preventing unarisen unwholesome states from arising, abandoning already arisen unwholesome states, arousing unarisen wholesome states, and maintaining already arisen wholesome states. This work is about fighting the internal battle against the rotting pegs of greed and hatred and actively cultivating virtue.
Finally, right concentration, samadhi.
When concentration is perfected through sustained effort and mindfulness, it suppresses the 5 hindrances. This allows for the mind to break through to the supramundane path in 4 stages, culminating in arahatship, the final eradication of the 10 setters that bind the mind to samsara, and the perfect direct comprehension of the 4 noble truths.
It is truly remarkable that a teaching based on rigorous analysis, nonviolence, and personal responsibility, not divine decree, managed to spread peacefully across the vast continent of Asia.
It speaks volumes about the universality of the psychological truths he uncovered. Buddhism spread without war, through monks and merchants, eventually reaching Ceylon, Thailand, China, Korea, Japan, and now globally, encompassing over 500 million followers. Violence in any form is absolutely contrary to the core teaching of non-harm, ahimsa.
Beyond the spiritual, the Buddha also engaged with political and social ethics, offering a systemic critique of injustice and misgovernance.
He certainly did. He was acutely aware of social inequality, criticizing oppression, excessive taxes, and corruption. The Kakavati Sahanada Sutta outlines the ideal ruler, the righteous wheel-turning leader or Kakavati, whose primary duty is establishing guard, ward, and protection according to Dhamma.
And the sources highlight a radical duty concerning economics that moves beyond simple morality.
The crucial duty was to actively give property to those in need. The Buddha recognized that social and moral decay is often rooted in economic failure. His analysis was systemic. Failure to alleviate poverty leads directly to theft, which leads to violence, which leads to the moral collapse of the kingdom.
So the solution was systematic redistribution, ensuring minimum material conditions were met, making the path to moral and spiritual life accessible.
Was this political ideal ever realized in history?
The most famous example is Emperor Ashoka of India in the 3rd century BCE. After a brutal conquest, he converted to the Dharma, renounced war and violence entirely, and dedicated his empire to the principles of righteousness.
He established infrastructure, hospitals, and promoted tolerance, demonstrating that the ethical path is applicable on a national and international scale, that hatred can indeed be met with kindness, even in governance.
Moving away from politics, the figure of the Buddha himself underwent a massive transformation in representation, both artistic and theological.
Artistically, in the earliest period, the depictions were strictly aniconic symbolic representations. You would see the Bodhi tree, the empty throne, or the footprints, symbolizing his presence and his path, but never the man himself.
It wasn't until around the 1st century CE that anthropomorphic statues began to appear.
Which reflects a growing desire to visualize and venerate the teacher.
And theologically, his status changed dramatically with the development of Mahayana Buddhism.
With the rise of Mahayana texts, particularly the Lotus Sutra, the historical Shakyamuni transformed into a transcendent, cosmic, and eternal figure. His historical life, the birth, the struggle, the awakening, and his final death were reinterpreted as merely skillful manifestations, nirmatakaya, and didactic devices, upaya.
So the historical life was a kind of theater performance for the benefit of humanity.
Essentially, yes. The idea was that the true Sakyamuni had been enlightened countless eons ago. He only manifested as a finite human being to provide a visible, relatable path for those of limited understanding. His death was seen as another strategic teaching device, a reminder of impermanence, even though his Dharmakaya or Dharma body remained eternally active, guiding beings.
Finally, we see the profound impact of his teachings even outside of Asian religious traditions, including a complex integration into Islamic intellectual history.
This is a fascinating example of cultural synthesis. Buddhist ideas were present in regions like Transoxiana and Khorasan from as early as the 2nd century BCE. Muslim scholars, encountering this hugely influential figure, felt compelled to integrate him into their own worldview, often identifying him as a monotheistic prophet. He was referred to as Bud or Shakyamuni.
What were some of the specific integrations they attempted?
Well, al-Shahrastani, a prominent Persian historian and scholar, is known for identifying the Buddha with the legendary Islamic figure al-Sir, the Green Man, a mysterious figure associated with esoteric knowledge and eternity. Later, in the 13th century, Rashid al-Din Hamadani, writing in the Mongol court, dedicated a chapter to him in his universal history, explicitly identifying him as a monotheistic prophet and placing his story within the standard lineage of prophets.
And there's even an attempt to link him to a prophet mentioned in the Quran.
Yes. Scholar Muhammad Hamidullah identified the Buddha with the prophet Du al-Kifl found in the Quran. His reasoning was based on the opening oath in a Quranic chapter, Surah 95.1, which takes an oath by a fig tree, followed by Mount Sinai.
So since Moses received revelation on Mount Sinai.
The fig tree was interpreted as the location of revelation for another prophet, identified as the Buddha, due to his enlightenment under the fig tree, the Bodhi tree. This just shows the incredible effort to reconcile and honor the historical influence of the Buddha within an entirely different religious framework.
This has been an intensive journey through a life dedicated entirely to human endeavor and intelligence. We've covered Siddhartha Gautama's radical renunciation, his discovery of a middle way, the Four Noble Truths as indispensable tasks for transformation, and the challenging but ultimately liberating doctrine of no self, anatta, which dismantles the foundations of clinging. We also detailed the holistic, step-by-step approach of the Eightfold Path, integrating wisdom, moral discipline, and mental culture.
What is most compelling about the entire body of work is its balance. The Buddha taught that perfection is not about mastering one discipline, but requires the equal development of compassion, karod, and wisdom, panya. True wisdom must be endowed with qualities like nonviolence and selfless love. Conversely, true compassion must always be guided by intellect and insight, preventing it from devolving into mere sentimentality. It is a path of radical balance between the head and the heart.
The teaching at its core is described as ihipasika, come and see. It is not a call for faith, but an invitation for personal verification, demanding that you transform belief into knowledge through experience.
So we leave you with this provocative question based on that principle of self-verification. If the path requires you to observe reality firsthand, what is one established belief in your own life, whether spiritual, political, or intensely personal, that you currently hold based on tradition or assumption, but which you need to actively verify and experience directly to truly transform it into concrete knowledge? The deep dive is complete.